8 people went to sleep in a small Iowa farmhouse. By morning, they were all dead, their skulls crushed by an axe that was still dripping blood. But here's the terrifying part. The killer never left the house. They found half-eaten food on the table, curtains covering every window, and something written in blood that no one has ever been able to explain. The sleepover. June 9th, 1912, Villisca, Iowa. The Moore family home stood quietly on the corner of 2nd Street, its white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Josiah Moore, a successful businessman and father of 4, had just returned from church with his wife Sarah and their children, Herman, 11, Mary, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. "Please, Mama, can they stay?" Mary begged, clutching her best friend Lena Stillinger's hand. Sarah Moore looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at Lena and her sister Ina May. The Stillinger girls lived just down the street, and the 3 had been inseparable since kindergarten. "Of course they can stay," Sarah smiled, brushing Mary's hair from her face. "But you girls need to promise you'll go straight to sleep after dinner. Church service ran late today." The children cheered, already planning their evening. They had no way of knowing that this innocent sleepover would become one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. As the sun began to set over the small farming community, the Moore household buzzed with activity. Sarah prepared a simple dinner of beans and bread, while Josiah read the newspaper in his favorite chair. The children's laughter echoed through the house, the last genuine sounds of joy that would ever fill those walls. "Girls, help me clear the table," Sarah called after dinner. The 3 girls giggled as they carried dishes to the kitchen, whispering about whatever secrets 10-year-old girls share. By 9:30 p.m., the house had settled into nighttime routine. Josiah locked the front door, checking it twice as he always did. Sarah tucked the youngest boys into their beds on the 1st floor, while the older children and their guests climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd-floor bedrooms. "Good night, my darlings," Sarah whispered, kissing each child on the forehead. "Say your prayers." In the darkness of the children's bedroom, Mary and Lena shared a bed while Ina May slept nearby. Herman had his own small bed in the corner. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of a train whistle. None of them heard the back door open at 2:47 a.m. The discovery. Monday morning, June 10th. The sun rose bright and clear over Villisca, but darkness had settled over the Moore household like a shroud. Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, noticed something odd. The house was too quiet. The curtains remained drawn, unusual for the Moore family who typically rose early. More concerning, the front door was locked, but the family wagon still sat in the barn. By noon, Mary's concern had grown to alarm. She approached the house and knocked. No answer. She tried the door. Locked. Peering through windows revealed nothing but drawn curtains. "Something's not right," she told her husband, who immediately fetched Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Ross arrived with a spare key. The moment he opened the front door, he knew something was terribly wrong. The house was silent, oppressive. Every curtain had been pulled shut, leaving the interior in gloomy darkness. "Josiah? Sarah?" Ross called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. No response. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The upstairs hallway stretched before him, doors closed. He reached for the handle of the children's bedroom. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The crime scene. The bedroom looked like a slaughterhouse. All 8 victims lay in their beds, their skulls brutally crushed. Blood had soaked through the mattresses and pooled on the floor. But what made the scene truly nightmarish were the details that followed. Sheriff Hank Horton arrived with several deputies. As they processed the scene, they discovered something that defied explanation. The killer had spent hours in the house after the murders. In the kitchen, they found a plate of half-eaten food. A sandwich sat partially consumed, bite marks clearly visible. The killer had made himself a meal while surrounded by the bodies of his victims. Even more disturbing, every mirror in the house had been covered with clothing. Every window was draped with blankets, sheets, or clothes, items clearly taken from the victims themselves. It was as if the killer wanted to ensure no reflection, no outside eyes could witness what had occurred. "Jesus Christ," Sheriff Horton whispered, surveying the upstairs landing. "He covered their faces too." Indeed, after bludgeoning each victim, the murderer had draped clothing over their destroyed faces. Even the two Stillinger girls, who weren't supposed to be there, had been methodically killed and covered. But the most chilling discovery came from the murder weapon itself, the Moore family's own axe, taken from their coal shed. The killer had used the blunt side to inflict the fatal blows, then switched to the sharp edge to mutilate the bodies further. The weapon had been deliberately placed in the downstairs bedroom, leaning against the wall like a calling card. The investigation begins. News of the massacre spread through Villisca like wildfire. Within hours, reporters from Des Moines, Omaha, and Kansas City descended on the small town. The story was too gruesome, too bizarre to ignore. Sheriff Horton called in the Iowa Bureau of Investigation, but they were ill-equipped for something of this magnitude. This was 1912. Fingerprinting was still in its infancy, and DNA evidence wouldn't exist for decades. "We need to consider everyone," Horton told his deputies. "Family, friends, enemies, strangers. Nobody gets ruled out." The investigation immediately focused on several key questions. Why were the Stillinger girls killed alongside the Moore family? Had the killer known they would be there? Why spend hours in the house after the murders? And perhaps most puzzling, why cover all the mirrors and windows? Reverend George Kelly, who had conducted the church service the Moore family attended before their deaths, became an early person of interest. Kelly was known to be eccentric, with a history of mental health issues. He had left town abruptly the morning after the murders, catching a train to Macedonia, Iowa. But Kelly was just the beginning. The investigation would span years, involve hundreds of suspects, and ultimately change American criminal investigation forever. The Reverend's secret. George Kelly was not your typical Presbyterian minister. The 41-year-old preacher had a history of strange behavior, speaking in tongues, claiming to receive divine messages, and wandering through cemeteries at night conducting impromptu services for the dead. When investigators tracked him to Macedonia, they found Kelly had already been questioned by local authorities. He claimed to have taken the early train for church business, but his timeline didn't quite add up. "We know you left Villisca at 5:19 a.m., investigators pressed. "That's barely 2 hours after we believe the murders occurred." Kelly's eyes darted nervously. "The Lord called me to spread His word. I go where He sends me." But as they dug deeper, a more disturbing picture emerged. Kelly had been obsessed with the Moore children, particularly Mary. He had given her special attention during Sunday school, sometimes keeping her after class to discuss religious matters. More damning, Kelly had been caught peeping through windows at night. Multiple townspeople reported seeing the Reverend standing in shadows watching homes. One woman claimed he had tried to enter her house, claiming he was checking on her spiritual well-being. Despite these disturbing revelations, there was no physical evidence linking Kelly to the crime. He had no blood on his clothes, no scratches or defensive wounds. The case against him was circumstantial at best. But the court of public opinion had already convicted him. The town that never slept. Villisca became a ghost town, but not in the way people expected. Instead of abandoning their homes, residents fortified them. Every house installed new locks, reinforced windows, and kept weapons nearby. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. The evening streets, once bustling with neighbors chatting and kids riding bicycles, became eerily silent. Everyone hurried indoors before dark. The town died that night, local shopkeeper Frank Jones told reporters. "We just keep breathing." The economic impact was devastating. Businesses closed as customers stayed home. Property values plummeted. Who would buy a house in a town where 8 people could be murdered in their sleep? But the psychological toll was worse. Marriages crumbled under the stress. Children developed night terrors. Adults became alcoholics, trying to numb the fear that the killer might return. And through it all, the Moore house stood as a monument to horror. Despite Sheriff Horton's best efforts to keep people away, curiosity seekers came from across the country. They would stand across the street, staring at the innocent-looking farmhouse where such brutality had occurred. Some claimed to see faces in the windows. Others heard children's laughter echoing from empty rooms. Whether these were genuine supernatural encounters or the product of overactive imaginations didn't matter. The house had become cursed in the minds of everyone who knew its history. The suspects multiply. As months passed without an arrest, the investigation expanded beyond Reverend Kelly. The brutality of the crime suggested someone with deep-seated rage, but the methodical nature, the covering of mirrors, the post-murder meal, indicated planning and composure. Frank Jones, the shopkeeper who had spoken so eloquently about the town's death, became the next major suspect. Jones had been engaged in a bitter business rivalry with Josiah Moore. Moore's successful farming implement business had undercut Jones's prices, drawing away customers. "I hated Josiah Moore," Jones admitted freely. "But I didn't kill him. I wanted to see him suffer financially, watch his business fail. Death was too good for him." Investigators discovered Jones had purchased a new axe shortly before the murders. His alibi, that he had been home with his wife, couldn't be verified. His wife initially supported his story, then later recanted, claiming she had been asleep and couldn't be certain he hadn't left the house. But again, physical evidence was lacking. The axe Jones purchased was clean, with no signs of recent use. His clothes showed no bloodstains despite the incredibly bloody nature of the crime. The case was becoming a nightmare for investigators. Everyone had motives, but nobody had evidence. The killer had been either incredibly lucky or incredibly careful. The traveling salesman. William Mansfield emerged as a suspect through a strange connection. A traveling salesman with a history of mental illness, Mansfield had been in Villisca the week before the murders. More intriguingly, he had been linked to similar axe murders in Kansas and Colorado. The signature was eerily similar. Entire families killed with axes, mirrors covered, time spent in the homes after the murders. But Mansfield had been hundreds of miles away when the Moore family died, or so investigators initially believed. Detailed investigation revealed Mansfield's alibis were carefully constructed lies. He had access to transportation, knew how to move quickly between towns, and most damningly, had a pattern of visiting places shortly before axe murders occurred. He cases the locations, one investigator noted, then returns later to commit the crimes. Mansfield was brought in for questioning, and his behavior was deeply disturbing. He spoke about the Moore murders with an unsettling familiarity, describing details that hadn't been released to the public. But when pressed for a confession, Mansfield clammed up. He demanded a lawyer and refused to speak further. Without physical evidence, prosecutors couldn't build a case. Mansfield walked free, but the investigation had revealed something chilling. The Moore family murders might be part of a serial killing spree that spanned multiple states. The hidden room. 2 years after the murders, a renovation project in the Moore house revealed something that would change everything. Contractors discovered a hidden room behind the basement wall, a space not mentioned in any building records. Inside the room were items that made investigators' blood cold. Newspaper clippings about the Moore family, a child's drawing of the house labeled Mary's Home, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a diary. The entries were fragmented and disturbing. "They don't see me watching. The children play and laugh, but they don't know I'm there. Mary has her mother's smile. She'll be the last to go. The axe is sharp. I've tested it on the trees behind the barn. One swing is all it takes. The Moores have been good to let me practice on their property. Tonight is the night. The Stillinger girls are staying over. 8 instead of 6. God will understand. This is his work." The diary was never conclusively linked to any suspect. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive, and fingerprints hadn't been taken from the items. an oversight that would haunt investigators for decades. But the discovery proved what many had suspected. The killer had been watching the Moore family for weeks, perhaps months, before the murders. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was carefully planned and executed. The confession. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, a man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the family, confessed to the Villisca killings. Moore was already serving time for similar axe murders in other states, and his confession seemed to solve the case. "I killed them all," Moore stated matter-of-factly. "The father first, then the mother. The children watched before they died. I made them watch." Moore knew details that had never been released: the position of the bodies, the covering of the faces, even the half-eaten meal. But his confession fell apart under scrutiny. He's confessing to everything, investigators realized. He wants to be known as the most prolific killer in American history. Indeed, Moore had confessed to dozens of murders across the country, many of which he couldn't have committed. He was a serial confessor, seeking notoriety rather than truth. The real killer remained at large, and the case grew colder with each passing year. The haunting begins. By the 1920s, the Moore house had become a local legend. Children dared each other to approach it at night. Teenagers told stories about seeing faces in the windows or hearing children's laughter from empty rooms. But the first documented haunting occurred in 1923, when a family rented the house despite its history. Within a week, they fled in terror. "The children wouldn't sleep," the father reported. "They kept talking about other children in their room, children who weren't there." Neighbors reported seeing lights in the house when it was supposed to be empty. Some heard the sound of an axe chopping wood in the middle of the night. Others claimed to see a figure in the windows, a man holding an axe watching the street. Whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena or the product of a town's collective trauma didn't matter. The house had become a living nightmare, forever linked to the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The modern investigation. In 1997, the Villisca Axe Murder House was added to the National Register of Historic Places. This designation brought new attention to the case, including modern forensic techniques. DNA analysis was conducted on evidence that had been preserved for decades. Blood samples, hair fibers, even the diary from the hidden room were examined using technology that hadn't existed in 1912. The results were frustrating but illuminating. Multiple DNA profiles were found, but contamination over the decades made identification impossible. The diary yielded no fingerprints. It had been handled by too many people over the years. But perhaps most significantly, geographic profiling suggested the killer had been local. Someone who knew the town, the house layout, the family's routine. Someone who could move through Villisca without attracting attention. The suspect pool had narrowed, but definitive proof remained elusive. The truth emerges. In 2016, a breakthrough seemed imminent when a woman came forward with a deathbed confession from her grandfather. According to her story, her grandfather had been having an affair with Sarah Moore. When Sarah threatened to expose the relationship, he had killed the entire family to silence her. The story was compelling. It explained the personal nature of the crime, the time spent in the house afterward, even the covering of the mirrors, perhaps from guilt or superstition. But the grandfather had died in 1945, taking any definitive proof with him. Investigators tracked down the grandfather's belongings, hoping for physical evidence. They found an old axe in his barn, but forensic analysis was inconclusive. Too many years had passed. Too many people had handled the weapon. The confession joined the dozens of others, compelling, detailed, but ultimately unprovable. The house today. The Villisca Axe Murder House stands today as both a museum and a monument to unsolved horror. Visitors can tour the property, seeing the rooms where the murders occurred, viewing crime scene photographs, and learning about the investigation. But the house offers more than history. It offers something more disturbing. The possibility that the killer was never caught, that justice was never served, that a brutal murderer lived out his life in freedom, while 8 innocent people remained in their graves. Some visitors report supernatural experiences, cold spots, unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched. Whether these are genuine paranormal phenomena or the power of suggestion doesn't matter. The house represents something deeper than ghosts. It represents the randomness of violence, the fragility of safety, the knowledge that sometimes the worst crimes go unpunished. The real horror. The true terror of the Villisca Axe Murders isn't in the supernatural or the unexplained. It's in the very real, very human elements that remain unsolved. Consider this. The killer spent hours in that house. He made himself a meal while surrounded by the bodies of his victims. He covered the mirrors and windows, ensuring privacy for his gruesome work. He took the time to cover each victim's face, showing either respect or shame for what he had done. This wasn't the work of a madman in the throes of psychosis. This was calculated, methodical, planned. Someone watched the Moore family, learned their routines, chose his moment carefully. Someone who could blend into small-town Iowa life, who could shop at the general store and attend church services while. The real horror is that he probably never stopped. Killers like this don't just stop. He likely moved on to other towns, other families, other unsolved crimes. The Villisca murders might have been his most famous work, but probably not his only one. The questions that remain. Why the Stillinger girls? If the killer was targeting the Moore family specifically, why kill the 2 friends who happened to be staying over? Was it convenience? Easier to kill witnesses than let them go? Or was it part of some darker plan we'll never understand? Why cover the mirrors? Superstition suggests killers don't want to see their own reflection, but this went beyond that. Every window, every reflective surface was obscured. Was he hiding from something spiritual, or was it purely practical, ensuring no one could see inside? Why stay for hours? The meal suggests someone comfortable with their crime, someone in no hurry to leave. Was he savoring the moment, completing some ritual, or simply ensuring he had covered every trace of evidence? Why has no one ever confessed convincingly? In an age where people confess to crimes they didn't commit for attention, why has no one provided details that only the killer would know? Is it because the killer died without telling anyone? Or because he's still out there, waiting? The Villisca Axe Murders remain America's most haunting unsolved mystery, not because of what we know, but because of what we don't know. Every answer leads to more questions. Every suspect has an alibi. Every piece of evidence is inconclusive. 8 people went to sleep in a small Iowa farmhouse on June 9, 1912. By morning, they were all dead, and more than a century later, we still don't know why. We still don't know who, and we still don't know if he's waiting to strike again. The house still stands. The questions remain. And somewhere in the shadows of history, a killer walks free, carrying secrets that died with him, or perhaps live on in the blood-soaked walls of America's most haunted murder house.